fourth by the end of this round. By virtue of the fact that we will be able to take out a lot of like the context and whatever contributions generally by the CJKs most probably. Few things how this debate is going to go. Let's understand first why the narrative exists. Don't take it seriously. So the point is, firstly, let's understand why the narrative exists. I think that we've been engaging in a lot of like political pragmatism to the point in which that your choices as a voter becomes convoluted. You think that it's either Trump or Camela. You don't really see that there are other points of there are other candidates with like better moral high grounds or better moral standpoints that are clearer and interact better with your policies or what you're aligning with because of the fact that the majority of people in society conform to either of these choices. Which means, and what is going on right now is only because of the fact that these political parties are the ones that, like, we're talking about the Democrats and Republicans are the ones engineering this choice to be something that is happening into this world. What this means is that they are the people skewing and trying to sidestep from their accountability, from actually trying to increase moral standards and also increase the standards of politics in how they should be going into, in terms of how they should be crafting their policies to be more direct or proximate to the people. It's also the way that they think the priorities are not quite important to them, even though these are things that are directly aligning with what the people want. For example, Camela used to actually say that you should seek for ceasefire for Israel. The moment that she is put into a spotlight of being a presidential candidate, she actually decides to say, oh, I think government aid or like just aid in general is enough. We don't need to actually, like back off from giving a ceasefire or actually at least try to negotiate for Israel to not be funded by the US. I think the reason why this happens is essentially because politicians are not held onto a higher level of accountability because the narrative is skewed to the point of what it is right now because people think that the choices that they have are convoluted. It's essential to understand this. Key framings into this debate. I think that number one, this debate has to talk about how discourse will entail into your choices in politics. I think it's also about number two, about the active decision making on how voters will actually respond in democracy. I think it's also thirdly, about how the standards in policies and the standards of accountability will be translated into. And lastly, we're also going to talk about why discourse will be productive or not, either in both sides, right? I think two arguments then. The first is generally understanding on an individual level, on voters, right? Yeah. I think voters don't really have the incentive later. I don't think that currently voters have the incentive to engage into critically why they make the choices that they do. They all jump on the bandwagon of thinking that this is the correct choice to make. This is the correct choice to make. But they don't really understand why those are the correct choices to make. I think a few reasons why. It's essentially because culturally, maybe your parents engage into it because your parent is a Trump supporter, so you engage into the bandwagon that you should be supporting because you're a conservative Christian anyways. Or maybe it's the way that culturally, nobody has actually disputed this thought. So this is a problem, right? Because we don't want, and for the most part, a lot of like people feel like they are powerless, right? And I think this is very bad. We need to essentially empower people to be able to make the choices that they want to make. And I think current politics, because of this narrative, makes a lot of people think that they are unable to change or have any kind of meaningful change that they want in this world. I think then, individuals on the first level, individuals feel morally convoluted because the choices that you have are only limited. People think that the choices that they have are either the Democrats from Camela or you actually have to support Trump. But the point is, the current options that you have are quite rich, like you have a diverse choices, right? You also have people like Jill Stein, who actually has moral high grounds that are better, that actually responds and interacts better with people. But you don't think that she's correct because of the fact that a lot of people think that, oh, but Camela has the more votes, so we should be taking the lesser evil, even though, like, in comparison to Trump. So the point is that people think that they're unable to actually jump on, like, to actually consider the better moral standpoints that they do have. I think then they actually think, a lot of times, they don't think that what they want is realistic or capable to be achieved as well because of the fact that people think because of the fact that politicians keep on telling them that you are unable to actually get what you want. There is also now incentive on the voters to consider that the ideas are capable when it is actually possible. It is actually very possible for, like, the US to not keep on sending Israel the funds. But on the second level here, why it does not
require people to participate in democracy effectively. We say that decision-making can only be made through convoluted forms of information. The impact here is simple. People make choices based on limited options without considering other circumstances or other things that they can choose. So you are pigeonholing the choices that you have. I think the second thing is that it also means that you do not interact or engage with the choices that you make because you just think that it's correct, but you don't think about why is it correct. The second argument here is simple. Why does this skew detrimentally for politicians' incentive? I think the incentive to take better moral standpoints and create better policies are not actually probable, right? Because politicians keep on being insulated from accountability as they skew options that people can inquire and consider into. Before that, closing.
What kind of narratives are likely to emerge in the absence of the lesser of evils narrative?
Yeah, I think it's the way that currently what that means is that if you don't want like political pragmatism, right? Because it only happens because of the fight of political pragmatism. You essentially have to create politicians that have like higher or clearer moral standpoints. That means you actually want to have like better and concrete policies, consistent policies, instead of thinking that you can lowball, which I think answers into my second argument, right? Because essentially, under their side, the narrative means that the politicians will not fulfill their moral mandate into democratic values and giving people the better choices that they want, right? Because you make them think that they're unable to create those options or buy for those options in the first place. The second argument is to understand that we need to increase the standards of accountability and how politicians will be creating policies, right? Yeah. And essentially, this is what our counterfactual or how the work will look like under our end. I think at first, people and politicians tend to lowball under their end. What we give on a constructive level is that number one, you have to create like better incentives of like or like increase the standards of like policies and accountability by essentially engaging more into the discourse. But number two, it means that even if like for example they say that they get some level of accountability because you create like policies that are more easier for you to get. I think the problem is that people still have no incentive for them to actually think about why do they need universal healthcare, or at the point in which they do get all of those things, a lot of people on the ground are already harmed and are unable to participate in democracy for those reasons. OG.
I promise I'm not the imposter. CEO will take the fort by the time my speech is done. I'm going to respond to OG before weighing out CEO in two reasons. Firstly, just the argument on the empowerment of people in general. Two call out towards this. Firstly, you have to question, Judge, the capacity of these individuals to make these decisions in the first place. Note that the instance that you're going to base your decisions off is firstly, your personal beliefs and things that you're tied of as an individual. Secondly, the culture that you're brought up in. And this is what Emma talked to you about your parents being a Trump supporter, etc. Thirdly, the internal biases that you are prone to as an individual and as an arbitrator of someone who is going to vote in the first place. But more importantly, Judge questions what happens when your choice is limited in the first place. And this takes out, or this is the main problem in OG that they have to solve in order for them to have any forms of contribution in debate. Because firstly, note that policies tend to be on extreme ends. At the point at which you have your liberal and democratic policies being pushed out at the same time, it's when you have the policies on extreme ends of the spectrum, that's the point at which you have a political divide between individuals. When your choice is limited, this becomes the tipping point. But secondly then, when you have dominant parties that dominate media at times, that dominate political at times, that cater to and pander towards specific groups that are able to get them some form of bias and some form of connectivity in the first place, therefore Judge, we highlight you and tell you the clear tipping point becomes the lesser standard of evil. I want to shit on your counterfactual a little bit more as well. Of the clearer moral standpoint that Emma posited to you in the last minute of her speech. Firstly, note that it's extremely ambiguous. We do not know what this clearer moral standpoints actually look like. She doesn't explain that as well. But secondly then, note that the lesser of evil metric that we posit to you is one that is objective, one that you can evaluate extremely easily, something that you can measure on based on all of these internal calculus that you have as an individual in order for you to go and vote. Whether this politician can carry out those policies, whether this candidate is a good person or a rapist, at the point of which you have internal metrics and internal compasses that you can use to make these objective decisions, is a point that we take. But thirdly, that is a clear reflection of capabilities. At the point of which you have these clearer moral standpoints or whatever that you positing, at the point of which you can use the lesser of evil to use as a metric, is when you absolutely have a clear reflection on whether these things can be passed or not. Two pieces of framing then, but before that, Judge, I think it's very important, Haikal, take you in a bit, that this motion is on discussions. That means in the instance that you're able to prove more amounts of discussions, healthy amount of discussions, and how this influence your votes then is something that we uniquely take on OO. Firstly, what is the usage of this? Note that this would probably take place in most instances within bad democracies. This means in points of which your options are limited, in which policies are extremely hard to determine. This is when this can be used as a tipping point. But secondly, especially when you have dominant parties, the point that Emma started her speech with the 17 other candidates in the US election being ignored, is exactly the problem that you as a US citizen will probably suffer. At the point of which you only have two dominant parties that are probably going to end up winning the election. This is the tipping point in order for you to decide whether you want to vote this person or not. This is the effective topic of conversation to start. That's the point of which we tell you this is where you make some people enter into discussions in the first place. Second piece of framing then, how do we unlock new groups of discussion? This immediately comes in substance as to why we unlock more forms of discussions in the first place. Note firstly, people are generally disinterested in politics and people who do not care. This means an individual who has absolutely no knowledge or idea as to what is happening within your political arena in the first place, because I know Trump's policies and I know that GOP is interventionist, but my girlfriend does not know this. At the point of which you have people like this who do not know what the GOP even is and what they stand for, is when this becomes a topic of conversation. Note that this is important because negativity tends to capture your human attention much more than the intricate policies that are being posited to you that require you to have some amount of brain cells in order for you to comprehend in the first place. At the least, the interest in the social background of the candidate, the proceedings that this candidate has went to before, the prostitute centers that this candidate has been caught in, all of these things are negative elements that tend to capture human attention, and these becomes your conversation starters in the first place. But secondly, that your interest digs deep. This means the influence and the way that this influences the way that you think and vote. This means you probably do not want someone bad to lead the country in the first place, because even if you have good policies, optics is something that is able to be measured. At the point of which this becomes a thought process of final decision maker is when you want to ensure that you have someone who is less of evil. Why is this justified? Because note that all these political parties oftentimes don't execute these ideas. Your populist parties that Emma wants to, or populist policies that Emma wants to try to posit to you, oftentimes does not come into manifestation in the first place. This looks like in India when BJP does not implement any of their policies, but also the opposition against them probably didn't do it as well. What is the benefit then? Haikal will take you in a little bit more. Firstly, that you prevent policy regression. This means you preserve the integrity within your system. You don't fall into these detriments in the first place, because the harms of your worst decisions are so bad that you have to circumvent all of these things right away. At the point of which this is the unique point where you have accountability or a basic platform to ensure that this individual does not capitalize off of the power that he has been given to you based on the social backing. So electing people means an extension of consent. This means you're allowing them intervention in places where they can infringe your autonomy, like forced drafting, like national service, if the individual that you're voting in is a military leader. So that lesser of evil is probably someone against him, someone who you're able to or able to accept the harms that are falling onto you. Secondly, this is a better platform to restart, meaning you allow for a system where restart is better. This acts as a buffer to detrimental change. It is a countervailing force to prevent all of these people from executing detriments. Sure.
What's the difference between I'm telling that Camila is lesser than me or I'm better than Camila?
Your moral standpoints and the social backing that you have been caught on in and your actions, I don't know, all of these other things, right? Secondly then, also how people obtain and make better discussions and better future progress. So at worst, and in OO's worst instances, if your policies do not launch, you have a good restart, because you have an individual who at least can have a better platform or restart, or a higher entry point in restarting all of these policies in the first place, because you know this individual is someone who is at least marginally better than whoever is standing against. Take note as well that this happens in the minority of it. But thirdly, that is a good intersection between policies and candidates, and this is the exact argument that allows us to claim the impact of healthy benefits. Note that people who support policies against people who support candidates is a huge detriment within these conversations in the first place. And the point of which we allow this intersectionality is, one, we have better conversations, two, we have more conversations that are going on. This means you allow people to have conversations on whether this individual can execute his policies or not. Sure, his policies may tend to be good, but this individual is not a good person. Can this come into probability? Can this manifest? Are things that you have? I'm going to end this debate with hydrocarbon oligarchs. You prevent volatile leaders like Putin. You have conversations that act as a check and balance for people to think through these things. You prevent and ensure all of these things from happening. For all of those reasons, we proved all three of our burdens.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna start my speech. Hold on. In 3, 2. I'm gonna directly engage with this, but before I say this, I believe 100% CO should be formed. But let's go on to what OO said then, right? Because, yeah. Firstly, let's look at the mental calculus of these individuals, right? Because OO was challenging the idea that, like, when it comes to political apathy, or the way for you to choose voters, right, is based on the mental calculus that you make when it comes to politicians, or like the options there lack of that you have. Specifically, when it comes to two extreme ideas being posited to you, that means your mental calculus is just to choose one that is less bad in comparison to the other. You know why this happens? It's because exactly the narrative exists. I'll explain to you the relationship between this, right? The reason why the narrative exists is because oftentimes the only thing that you will consider who is less extremist in comparison to the other. That's why the narrative exists in the first place, right? And this is responding to the POI, by the way. If in a world where there is lack of this narrative, that means you have to look at the overall standpoint when it comes to this individual's moral compass specifically. And this is directly helping Emma's case, which they completely neglected. The reason why the moral standpoint is not ambiguous, like they mentioned, is because when it comes to the way that your policies are directing towards the personality that you are as a politician, means that oftentimes, right, these are things that you believe in. That means if a policy sounds like it's very extremist, then that's probably a reflection of the identity of this politician in the first place, which makes sense, right? Because technically you are an extremist right person. For instance, like Trump, you believe in conservative, like economic policies, for instance. In this particular instance then, right, if there's no other option, you would say the less of the evil is the one that's not, like, you know, conservatively economic policies, for instance. This is the reason why the narrative shouldn't exist in the first place, because it harms the ability for you to think about not the person, but the policies that they have, which leads to also what they said in the second part, right, when it comes to the good restart argument. They say that the good intersection that they have when it comes to candidates and policy is that when you have more trust on the person being able to carry out the politics. Guys, this is exactly the reason why people don't vote for other people aside from Kamala Harris, right? We have a lot of good people in the Democratic Party, but you chose Kamala because she's the one that's the most representable. You know what this is? This is populism. You vote based on the character of the person themselves. You don't vote on the policies. So here's my question then, right? How do the intersectionality happens on their side? Because technically, if you're voting for Kamala because she has the most representable ability to carry out all of her policies, that means why would you vote for policies about other people, right? Because you don't believe in other people. A clear example that I can use is in the previous election, right? Pete Buttigieg, or Buttigieg, is like already leading in the first place, right? Like a lot of people believe in his ideologies, a lot of people buy the policies that they make. But end up, he lost, and at the end of the day, people stop voting for these individuals because they believe that Biden is the best lesser of the two evils, because they believe that Biden has the abilities to do it, until they realize it's too late, because technically Biden stutters every single time he gives a speech. That's the problem when it comes to voting between the lesser of two evils, right? Because you evaluate not based on the policies that they are making, but based on the characters of these individuals. If they are lesser than two evils, you vote for the other person because technically they're not as evil as Trump, right? And that's what's happening again. That's why the reason now is we see that Biden is back. Now there are more individuals who are probably voting for Trump because technically, when you think about it, Trump is not as evil as it's pictured. Sit down. Right? So now I'm going to explain to you about the arguments that I have on my side, right? When it comes to how the discourse that they wanted to champion for will not be productive. And this is directly engaged with the case, right? Because the case coming from opening opposition is that discourse is better on our side. I'll tell you why it's not better. First and foremost, the consequences of them defaulting into the narrative. I think this is something that they lack of, right? When it comes to how people, the mental calculus part is because you have a narrative that defaults the mindset that you have for individuals. The idea behind this argument is to show to you specifically that when it comes to people deciding who to vote for, oftentimes they will have a fail-safe mechanism because they don't want to care about the policies that they want to champion for, because for generations they know that they will not win on the policies that they want to vote for. So instead, let's vote on the person that we believe is better in comparison to the other party. That means, right, you block out meaningful policies that reflects greatly on all of the voter base. And the reason why, like they say, that you can that you can soften the blow or accept the impacts is because this narrative is also elitist to the person, to like a lot of the individuals, right? If you're not someone who's part of the majority, oftentimes you can say, it's fine, I'll just choose this other guy and then we'll reform or reshape the policies that this person is going to make at the end of the day. But that's not true for most individuals at the end of the day, right? Because most of them, or like the minority of these individuals, don't get a say because the big ones, or like the majority of the voters, are the ones who are making or diluting the conversation when it comes to the policies, because they say, this is the lesser of the two evils, you can't say anything else, vote for these individuals. This is exactly why you don't get productive discourse, right? Because people will just default to that particular narrative. Before I go on, yeah, go ahead.
In the absence of multiple choices, political discussions tend to polarize. If I'm gonna be called a baby killer or Bible-toting conservative, why would I engage in this discussion?
Here's the reason, right? The way that you polarize is when you don't limit your options to just two, right? That means, right, oftentimes the other candidates are overshadowed by the person who has the most charisma, the one who has the most sigma energy, to the point where they are able to also become the best possible candidate. That means oftentimes you have more political parties from Democrats, politicians from Democrats, for instance, dropping out and say, I endorse Kamala Harris because technically she's the better between the both of us within our own political party. But let's just push her up because she has the most charisma. I think this is exactly the reason why you have the lack thereof when it comes to a multiple layer of policies for you to vote for at the end of the day. But secondly, right, let's talk about political innovation. And this is the crucial part when it comes to why the diversity between two evils is not it, guys. Political innovation means that a lot of the times, right, because of the narrative, you don't have any ability for you to innovate. What does it mean? It means oftentimes politicians default into the idea that maybe if I was sneaky enough to have a policy that sounds a bit better in comparison to the other guy, I can actually have my own policy go through as well, because eventually they will vote for me regardless because I am clearly the lesser of the two evils. You stifle individuals' ability to make better policies because they think that the ability for them to win doesn't depend on having good policies, but rather being the lesser of the two evils. That means you don't have the ability for you to develop better policies at the end of the day because you believe that this is not the reason on how you win political race anyways. What does it do then, right? The impacts, and this is going to argue for all of options. The reason why this is bad is because you won't have individuals understanding why is it that their votes matter, not because of the person, but because of the political policies in the first place. A lot of these arguments will just argue to you that the policies matter at the end of the day. In the fact that there lack of this narrative, we are obviously going to reshape how politics are going to look like at the end of the day. Proud to propose.
Okay. They said after the look at more candidates, you get only look at more candidates, the World Cup thing kind of show more. I will try one day, but I think probably more than which is why the only point because this exists regardless of narrative.
Anyone else want? Let's jump to stress.
Simply because it is impossible for you to look at other forms of candidates. So then, it's a literal impossible.
Yes. Welcoming Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Debating is not suitable with SDG. Debating is not suitable with SDG. This is really doing the paper climate change.
Yeah man, it's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable at all.
Kita pakai iPad dulu.
Yeah. So ugly, man.
It's your fault I help you.
Cepat tolak ni.
Discussion is not as easy as if you silence one party and they just die off. I think it's still likely that politicians still defend their ideology, but discussions can still happen. Voters of both sides can still talk about what other things that they want. Therefore, silencing is not as easy what they claim. Secondly, what is OG defending? They're defending systemic change, and we think it's not likely to happen. Because if the prerequisite for them to achieve all their benefits is for there is to be a systemic change, which is the entire system, for us to have a better democracy, for us to have better politicians, for people to actually demand better. We think it's not as likely because this takes time to build. This takes decades in order for you to have achieved all of this. At least what we posit and out of the house is to have much more gradual changes because of the framing that Thivagar has proved, in which this particular narrative exists because a lack of better choices. Of course, in amazing democracies where life is perfect, of course you would want better and better politicians. But you cannot demand this in situations where both situations are bad. Therefore, you have to weigh which one's actually going to be good or not. We are going to defend gradual change in which we think it's much more likely and it's much more feasible we win this round then. Let's look at check and balance mechanism because they're saying that, oh, there's no check and balance mechanism, therefore only one idea would persist. We think that this check and balance mechanism also trickle down to policies that you can discuss. I think the weird part of Syafiq's speech is that, oh, therefore you just see the lesser evil as a person, not the policies that they're going to bring. I think this is so weird because policies and character can still exist on the same spectrum. Of course, your policies going to be reflective of your policies are going to be reflective of your characters. You have policies based on what you believe. This is also the reason why people vote in populist policies, and which, if they do not prove why populist policies are very bad to begin with, we don't think that it's a harm. Because if populist policies means that a lot of people actually agree in these particular policies, because there's a general consensus that this is what we need to solve. This is what the people believe in. I think populist policies they do not prove the harms of populist policies. Lastly, what is the harms of worse decision? We think that they did not credit for what is so bad about the worse decisions, about this evil, right? We have to circumvent this first. Because in this situation, if one party takes into power, they would have all of these effects in which it is irreparable. Think three things. Firstly, ideas that are extremist. They will propagate extreme ideas like socialism, anti-women rights, and limiting freedom. Secondly, they will disrupt systems of democracy. This means that it will cause irreparable harms against separation of power, consolidation of power and creation of political dynasties, creation of monopoly and governance, disabling opposition parties. These are likely to be harmful. Of course, you don't know all of these harms in hindsight, but at least you can still expect all of this because you actually understand these people and because this discussion actually attracts more discussion to happen on social media, to actually happen on the ground. Because this debate is about a discussion debate. They have to prove on how they have a lot more discussion. They're just proving that their discussion are better, but because if they don't have as much discussion, this means that you won't have as much variety of voices. You cannot win that particular harm then. Thirdly, and they are also likely to cause irreparable economic harms. Because when you are in power, it's likely that you're going to take up loans and massive debts because you can create all of this. Because the power that you have, you cannot have any check and balance mechanism where majority of parliament comes from the same party. They are likely to just vote to pass any particular policies. Last issue is political airtime. We think that if there are cases about political airtime, if we do not actually attract more people to actually voice up in this politics, because people are actually tired of politics. Because in their case, in their side of the house, in order for you to actually get changes, you have to actually demand a lot more. You have to demand a perfect democracy, which is unlikely to happen. At this point in time, the political airtime would mainly be controlled by the elitist people who are politics themselves, because they have the power, they have the money to control media. At this point in time, you don't have the variety of voices that Thivagar has already explained. What is the point of change that they expect then? For them to have entirely new candidates? It's not like there is no better candidates, right? But they cannot step up because these candidates, in order for you to represent the party, are not chosen by the voters. It's chosen by the members of the party themselves. This means that even if the voters do not agree, they will still have to vote for Kamala Harris, even if the people do not agree with Kamala Harris at the end of the day. So of course, if that is an option, but absent of it necessitates this form of discussion. We think this is too high of a burden to create systemic change. It is not likely to happen. This correlates to jumping into the government support because people do not care about politics, would still not be under their sides. Because there's no incentive for you to actually care about politics because all your visions are still unachievable. Then it is still impossible for you to demand such huge systemic change. But the only way that this OG case can fly is for America to abolish two-system party within the next likely. Haikal.
It doesn't have to be perfect. I just have to be slightly better than the other person, right?
The point here that I'm saying that I think it's perfect segue to my argument. We think that there's already changes in the worldview, where there's a lot more discussions in wider area of political issues, where social media and political airtime are much more accessible by people. But this argument, the prerequisite to this argument, is for people to actually join in this discussion. This proves how people will not demand for less, since we can still discuss on other issues. It's not as simple as having a lower Senate. As an example, if PH is doing well in economy, people can still demand in other areas of politics. As an example, in agriculture, in any other policies, because you can still have all of this, because there's a lot more discussions happening in social media, and because it's easy for you to access all of this discussion. Secondly, you at least lessen the chances of voters' apathy, since voters are not constantly met with despair, because their politicians can never be good as other countries. The strategic conclusion is that standards change for people and voters. They can demand more when the political situation gets better. This is how we can co-opt political innovation. And this also answers Haikal's POI, because if that means that the standards can get better and better, you don't only have to get better. During your tenure when you get elected, you have to actually show that you are getting better in order for you to claim all of these benefits. Two weighing that. One, you attract more people to discuss politics since it is more realistic. Discussions can happen since you can change standards. What is the threshold? Instead of it remaining static in this what government proposes, you can demand more to politicians who cannot even meet the bare minimum. This is a tipping point to ensure that people care. Secondly, we have more people in voicing out. Instead of you giving up with politics and voicing out, this is especially important for minorities who cannot have any other ways in order for them to voice out except through politics. Lastly, what is the basics of comparisons of candidates? Firstly, of course, going to be the moral standpoint in what you care, and this means that the decisions in democracy reflect the majority. At least it's the reflective of what they think is best. Secondly, I think we have to be more charitable towards the characterization of voters here, because we have better education now. Because education can bring better changes, because they know what is democracy and what is the bare minimum. Still, you have to be more charitable in this particular particular instances. Secondly, it's also likely that voters can actually learn because you have much more discussion. You teach in schools on what is it like for you to have a proper democracy, what are the benefits of democracy, and even if the debate happens in the words of democracy where there is nothing at all, where you don't have any form of technocrats to teach them, and it is very unlikely by the way, you still have social media. We can teach to the people what are the benefits of democracy and what are the things that you have to demand for. This is your right. Syafiq and TJ, you have work tomorrow. Go to work lah.
Lupa bodoh.
Kulit. Kau poster tu.
Aku dah fikir aku punya closing line, so aku macam lupa CEO is fourth. CEO is fourth.
Right, you just ready? This debate is not about whether or not we should have comparison or not, but rather what type of comparison that we should use. Either it's a negative comparison or a positive comparison. The case coming from CJ is going to be very clear. The first thing we're going to do is going to explain what exactly the positive comparison that we're going to use on our side of the house as a replacement of the narrative, and then I'll argue to you as to why exactly we base all things in this round. I don't know who is fourth, but I'm pretty sure CJ is first. The first thing I want to explain then, what exactly this narrative is about. And I think it's very simple. The narrative is just for you to prove that you are better than the other candidates. And here's a very important illustration to make. Because if it's about the lesser of the two evil, it's very easy for you to just say that you are better, that you are lesser than the other persons by pointing out the evil that they have committed and you have not committed. So for example, maybe Camela doesn't do enough weighing in her speech, but I do a bit of weighing which proves that I am better than her. This means that it's about how exactly that is about the lesser of the two evil. The comparative on our side of the house, you focus on the positive. So rather than saying what is Camela is bad at, I'm going to explain what exactly I'm really good at, and that's how I'm able to prove that I'm better than her. That's what we're going to support on our side of the house. And the question that becomes, why exactly then this is the narrative that we have to support? Because politics has always been about the comparison. The question then becomes, why exactly, at the point where you oppose this negative comparison, the positive comparison will fill in, because that's how the only way for you to be able to adjust and also measure whether or not these politicians or policy are better. First extension then, why exactly the lesser of the two evils creates the race to the bottom? And the framing here is very important. I want to clearly understand why exactly the narrative itself creates mudslinging. And the reason is very simple. Conveniences. It is so easy for you to just say the other people haven't done enough or have done so many bad things rather than proving that you are better. Which is why a lot of people opt into the lesser of the two evil, because they believe that it's easier for you to just nitpick the character or nitpick the problems that exist within the policy or the people on the ground. Why exactly this is very harmful? Because if one person does it and the other person does it, it creates a race into the bottom, because every single person is just going to nitpick the problems that exist with each other and nitpick the problems that exist within the policy rather than thinking about why exactly their policy are better than the other. Because of this, it literally creates more reasons as to why exactly people are discussing about the worst, the negative part of their policy rather than the positive part of their policy. I think there are three impacts here. The first is that we are going to justify any form of the harms and any form of the bad the negative part of like the policy and the politician. So for example, we constantly say that, well, it's good that we have Trump, even though he is probably misogynist, sexist and racist, because at the very least, he at least like doing good things for our economy. But the problem is that you're going to continuously justify that it's okay for a president or a leader to become sexist, to become racist, to become misogynist. All of these things means that in the future, we're going to reduce our bar and believe that it is okay for us to do all these things. Principally, we should oppose this because of the fact that the idea is that we should uphold all these leaders to a certain level and to push it further. But second and more importantly, it shifts this discussion. Because previously, instead of discussing about whether or not for example, like the fiscal policy is good or bad, we're going to discuss about why exactly then this person is not really that good, this person potentially could be sexist, this potential person is racist, rather than discussing the ideology that they create. This is very harmful because that means that you remove the ability for you to have meaningful discussion. They say quality means nothing. I say quality discussion allows you to be able to access better policy outcome in the end of the day. The comparative is simple. We create a higher bar and higher standard because every single person, it is insufficient for you to just say other person is lesser than you. You have to prove why exactly you are better. So it's not enough for me to say that Camela doesn't do enough. I have to justify why exactly my contribution is far more meaningful in comparison to Camela's contribution in this round. That's how you are able to ensure that people are getting better. Why exactly this is important in the round then? Number one, it's because you are able to access the accountability that OG say that they want to achieve, but they haven't proved by the end of the debate. Because now on our side of the house, you can constantly question, yes, sure, maybe you are lesser than that person, but are you really that better than potential other candidates who can also replace them? This means that you're able to actually have better policy and better
ability to get better politicians. This first extension wins us against everyone in this round because of the fact that we're able to get more meaningful policies rather than them just having more discussion which leads to nothing. Second extension then. Why exactly the lesser of the two evil? Kill the political optimism. Because it creates the echo chamber that believe that we are stuck with the worst things that we have right now. Why exactly it kills the political optimism? Because presumably opt is right? You have no choices. But I don't think that's a good thing. Because it makes people believe that they have no choices right now and they have no ability to actually change the system and to create the choices for themselves. Here's the problem. Democracy is not a coercive process that mandate you to have participation. What that means that a lot of people can opt out of the system and most people will opt out of reason for three simple reasons. The first is because every time they have to vote for somebody who is the lesser of the two evil, they feel complicit for the harms that the leader is going to commit, which means that they're unlikely to actually even participate in the ballot box. Secondly, it's the fact that there's a lack of change. If I know that everyone sucks, I'm unlikely to actually even vote because what's the point of me voting because it doesn't create any changes. But thirdly, I want to uphold the principle that I hold close to my eyes, which means that insofar as I vote somebody who's going against my principle, it is unlikely for me to vote in the first place. The conclusion here is simple. What that means that they reduce the participation from the people on the ground. I think it's very harmful because Asan said that he's going to get more discussion, haven't proved that, we proved to you why exactly participation gets worse. But the participation is not only about the discussion, the participation about the ballot box, the participation about the state instrument as well. So for example, if people do not believe the Clarion government is legitimate, they are unlikely to actually cooperate and actually help the system and ensure that the system are working. So for example, the CJS system are relying on the participation of the people. Now people don't care about the system because they know that it's corrupted to a point where they have no ability to actually create changes and no one going to opt out in the first place. But finally, you become the instrument of change yourself because you believe that you can create changes because you no longer have the political pessimism. You know that you are able to create changes on our side of the house because this is better, because you believe they are better. Sure, Isaac.
When you do positive things, you lessen the negative / evil as well. Why can't we co-opt all of this?
No, because again, this debate is about what type of comparison that you want to focus on. We're focusing on the positive comparison. You have to explain why exactly the positive comparison are going to survive the negative comparison when I already explained that people opt into negative comparison because they believe that it's the most convenient way for you to actually prove that you are better. Final extension. Why exactly is the lesser of the two evil reduces the choice that you have because it fits into the risk-averse mentality that you have. OG say that, well, right now we do not have enough choices and we should expand it, but never explain why exactly you're going to get more choices. The first reason is as to why exactly it fits into the idea of risk-averse is because the lesser of the evil literally based on the potential that other choices are actually very harmful. So for example, you are just comparing between Democrats and Republicans, but you do not consider other parties as well because you believe that they're only going to be much worse in comparison to others because you know that you are only talking about the worst, which means that the other people who are not in consideration are much worse. Which means you are unlikely to consider their radical idea or like the changes or the things that they might be different. Why is it important? MRCF is pigeonholing. I disagree. It's not about the pigeonholing. It's about the gatekeeping of choices of the people on the ground. But beyond that, it means that you have no ability for you to actually create changes because you need the feminism to actually be radical in the first place to actually achieve these changes, but you do not access that on that side of the house. Camela will do a lot more, and I don't think CG is going to get fourth in this debate.
Wise debater once told me, in order to get the first, you must embrace the fourth. So if everyone thinks CEO is getting fourth, I guess we are getting the first. Anyways, I want to talk about the political discussions that go beyond the people that engage in that discussion. But crucially, what CEO is going to be talking about is about it needs to have a discussion about the actors who are crafting this narrative in the first place and how it influences the choices of people there. Necessarily, this is upstream of whatever opening is talking about because they're talking about expanding discussion and how people engage in that. We talk about the shaping of this narrative in the first place and the kinds of discussions we have in the first place that's necessary upstream of what they talk about. So we're going to look at political actors that shape policy narratives in the first place. Necessary, we'll talk about politicians, we're talking about advocates, activists, and social movement leaders. Because crucially, the narrative of lesser of two evils affects people that these movements and politicians can work with, that they can take funding from, that they can platform with, that they can partner up with in order to get the outcomes at the end of the day. Later, how does this weigh out against the Gov bench? It beats both OG and CG because the Gov bench talks a lot about
about why you can get more transparency and accountability in the counterfactual without necessarily explaining the process and the likelihood of these things manifesting in the first place. CG talks about alternative and positive comparison, which I personally think is great, but it's unclear to me how making a positive comparison against Kamala Harris is going to get her to change that policy or then vote for an alternative. It's also upstream from OO for the reasons that I discussed earlier. I want to engage with CG and just get this thing out of the way. Because crucially, the problem with CG and with the government in general is that they do not prove the likelihood of this positive comparison manifesting in positive change. Because you can talk about all the things that you want. You can talk about how all these politicians is really great and they need to change, they need to pass specific policies. But the question is, can you really get it? So Kamala has problems with criticized for her stance on immigration policies and for her support of Gaza. But even if you point that out, what exactly is going to happen? Who is going to stand up and do something that's better? Because of the lack of alternatives and the strong barriers of entry and necessarily amassing enough political capital for you to fight the existing incumbents of whoever it is that you don't like, it is unclear who is going to step in and change things at the end of the day. Even if you could, if you're talking about multilateral systems like the UK or like Germany or like Israel to some extent, when there are too many issues and not enough resources to go around, you tend to split support. So like things like religious schools, religious education in Malaysia, that's a very, very like controversial issue. It's not clear who supports what. You can have one politician that supports it, one politician that opposes it, but necessarily that splits the support base, and that means it is unlikely for either of these two policies to get passed or to get things in the first place because there isn't enough capital to push it forward. So it's unclear what the optimists can do in the CG's world. It is unclear how accountability manifests in the Gulf world. I think at the end of the day, it is more likely than not that you get no outcomes in the Gulf bench at the end of this debate. So let's talk about the extension and about shaping discourse. At the top, these political actors, as I flagged, are politicians and activists. Politicians generally want to get votes, they want to get support, etc. They still want to get more people, they want branding and like partnership and like working with people on the ground, which is why the narratives and the things they say are likely to reflect that. Later, activists and advocates are movements that are fighting for change, and they're asking people for awareness, for votes, for donations, to put these things on the policy agenda and to get these things moved forward. Crucially, these are all people who make public statements to garner support by showing that their values align with their audience. How does this narrative affect the kind of political support that they can get? Understand that policy making is a very, very dirty game. There are too many actors wanting different things, and so compromise is ultimately ugly but extremely necessary. That is why the only way for Anwar to form the unity government and to pass all of the reforms that he has done, from the budget to subsidy rationalization to fuel rationalization to the corruption reform to arresting all kinds of people and empowering MACC, was because he was willing to partner up with UMNO, right? With that Zakid Hamidi, whatever, accused of so many corruption charges. And he was able to do this by saying this was the lesser of two evils. The alternative was PN and Muhyiddin that were never going to work with us. And the reason that this was okay was the reason that this worked out was because people said, oh yeah, that's true. Maybe this isn't great, but it's still better than the alternative, which is either working with PN or just not having any unity government and having a common parliament at the end of the day. It's the same thing with COVID stimulus in a bit. So like the COVID stimulus packages that needed to pass Congress needed to include a degree of like bailouts for large companies, right? If not, the Republicans were never going to support it. And the way the Democrats sold it to their followers was to say, this was the lesser of two evils, this was the only way we could do this to pass stimulus to the people who needed it most on the ground. The positive comparison that the Gulf bench wants to make, which is to criticize those things, which unfortunately means these changes were unlikely to happen in the first place, and that's why they were never going to get the kind of change they want to talk about just a bit later. So on the comparative, without these narratives, we think that political leaders and movement leaders are much more likely to be scared to take risks on making controversial alliances in the first place. So Anwar wouldn't be able to form this unity government with UMNO BN because he couldn't justify it to his supporters. The queer movement couldn't take corporate funding because it was controversial and they couldn't justify it to their supporters. Movements can ask followers to vote for Kamala as the lesser of two evils because of certain things that she did, which means that they'll have to ask the voters not to vote at all. All of these things mean we're unlikely to get change happening at the end of the day, which means the discussion do not manifest in anything productive, which is something that's pretty terrible. Before I weigh this, go.
Yeah, compromise is what makes the complacency. Only under our world we get people with political independence, with moral clarity that can make those demands, at least in those days.
Compromise gets things done. Because in your world, you can make demands, but nobody fulfills that demand. You don't have the capacity or the capital to fulfill those demands. So it's really, really deeply unclear as to what the tangible impact that you get on the Gulf bench is. Okay, how do you weigh this? Why is this winning? One, this narrative gives leaders more leeway to make compromises as necessary for progress, to create the incremental change, to do things like horse trading, to pass policy reforms, like the unity government in Malaysia, like the COVID stimulus packages that we talked about here. The comparative is no progress on the other side, because when you say that this guy is bad, every person in this political system is bad, then you kind of polarize and you kind of isolate yourself and make it difficult for you to form partnership with others. Note also, this is a tipping point, because it's only when movement gains traction, when they gain activation energy, when they gain momentum, you get